My name is William A. Sims. I'm an attorney with the Knoxville Bar Association. We're here today, August 31, 2016, to interview Knoxville lawyer Louis R. Hagood as a part of the Knoxville Bar Association's Legal History Video Project, which is conducted under the auspices of the Knoxville Bar Association Archives Committee. Please state your full name and date of birth.
Louis Russell Hagood, July 13, 1930.
Mr. Hagood, could you tell us about your youth and your family and where you grew up as a young man?
Yes, I was number 7 of 8 siblings, and I think the 8th one, I should make an observation, his name is Larry Hagood, was my younger brother, and he is the father of Jeff Hagood, who's a lawyer practicing in Knoxville today. We lived in a farmhouse on a 100-acre farm. Dad was a rural mail carrier, but we worked the farm. We had all sorts of chores and things to do. The farmhouse itself was uninsulated. We had no indoor plumbing, so we had only the outdoor plumbing that you have in those days, and we did not have electricity until 1940, when I was about 10 years old.
Where was this farm?
This was located in Persia, Tennessee, which is not a big metropolis because it had a little school, a couple of churches, and a post office and a general store, and that's why it got its name. It's located about 5 miles from Rogersville, Hawkins County, Tennessee.
Okay. What were some of those kind of chores that you were telling us about?
Well, they weren't exactly pleasant. The fun one was you had to milk, trying to get some cows and milk them, you know, before you went to school, and then when you got off, back from school, you had to kindling for the fires, you had to pick blackberries in the summer, suckering tobacco, just all the chores, putting up hay and working in the garden, all the crap that you get when you're that age, but nobody didn't know any better, and that's what we did.
This was in the Depression years.
Oh, it was a big old depression back in the 30s. More than the 30s, you know, everybody was dirt poor. I mean by that our neighbors, nobody knew any better. My dad was on the mail route, and he would, in the early days, when I was a baby, he would ride a horse 30 miles on a route, and he later got a car in the 40s, late 30s, I think. But when he was gone, we were spending some time on the farm or either in school.
Where did you go to elementary school?
Well, I just thought of that. They have a 2-room school in Persia at that time called the Big Room and the Little Room. And the Little Room was first 4 grades, 1 through 4, and the Big Room was 5 through 8. And it was also unheated, except, in the summer, no air conditioning. We had pot-bellied stoves for the winter. As a matter of fact, the teacher was very strict. My dad and mother were strict disciplinarians, but so was your teachers. And if you got a little out of line in school, they would pick you up with a nap your neck and bust your you-know-what, and sometimes take you up the head of the class and do it for emphasis. And if you got a spanking at home, you're going to get another one when you get home. That's pretty much the cause. So they supported the school and the teachers. But the first real job I had making with any remuneration was the school in the wintertime had to start those pot-bellied stoves to get some heat in those rooms. So they hired me to come down an hour early, so I'd get up early and walk down to school.
Barefooted, of course.
And until wintertime, well, frost. We weren't barefoot until we had the frost came, that's for sure. But nevertheless, I'd build the fires in both rooms about an hour before the classes came at 8 o'clock. And for that job, I got the magnificent sum of $25 a week. $25 a week? I got 25 cents a week. I'm sorry. Nobody knew $25 in those days. Yeah. But I was happy to have it because things were a little tight around, as you might imagine. We lived on a farm. We had no problem with eating and stuff like that.
What are some of the memorable events that occurred during your childhood?
Oh, I don't know. There were so many of them. everybody was, we didn't have any problem with finding something to do. Everybody had a horse or a bicycle or something. And I guess I would think is one of the most memorable things in childhood was horses. I loved horses. Dad had horses. But he bought me and Larry a Shetland pony. And that story I remember very well. We weren't big enough to get on the pony, but he bought him trained, so if you switch him on the front legs, he would lay down, and then we could get on, and that's how we did it. But times were kind of hard, so I heard Daddy talking on the telephone about possible selling that pony, because some doctor wanted it over at Rogersville. So he was going to come over and look at it that afternoon. And me and Larry heard that, so we got our pony, whose name was Nellie, by the way, and we took Nellie in the house and hid her in the closet. And that guy came to look for it, and he looked at Daddy all over the farm, and finally he drove off. So we felt we were going to get a big whooping anyhow, so we had better tell Daddy. So he was kind enough to say, if you love the pony that much, you can keep it. But one thing you've got to do this afternoon, that's go in there and clean the mess up that that pony made in the closet.
Must have been a big closet.
It wasn't too big, but yeah, it was pretty big those days. You know how closets are in farmhouses.
Right.
Trying to think of some others. I know we used to do a lot of switchblade knife business. Everybody had a Barlow or a switchblade knife, and they would carry it. I mean, every boy had that. That's very common, and we would go around throwing it, target practice, throw it into the garage, throw it in the barn, throw it into what was next. I hesitate to tell this story, but I will anyhow. One day Daddy had a big boar hog out in the field, and that's not, I just said, let me keep that big old hog out there. So I took a Barlow knife, a switchblade knife, and I threw it, and I hit him, and it stuck him right in the side. And that knife sat there and flew up and down like this, and I said, oh God, my dad's going to kill me, and I just killed this big boar hog. Unfortunately, I walked around a while and the knife fell out, and I went in there and retrieved my knife, and I never told anybody else, and I guess I can tell it after 50 years.
And you didn't get kicked out of school for having a knife?
No. Oh goodness, everybody had a knife. We used to play mumble peg for the old folks who know how to play mumble peg, and there was so many things we used to do with the knife. Very helpful to have a knife.
As Mr. Arnett once asked a witness during a deposition, Mr. Hagood, where were you on December 7, 1941?
Oh, yeah, that was an event. I should not have forgotten that. We had finally got electricity in the 40s, and Daddy had a radio, but nobody else could turn it on. But I do remember this. December 7th, 1941, we were sitting in the old back room there where Daddy had the radio one Sunday night listening to something, and it got interrupted when the President Roosevelt got on the radio and talked about Japanese invading Pearl Harbor. And he talked about that a while, and he concluded with the greatest remarks. I remember, quote, "This day shall live in infamy." And I heard the original version of that. I've heard it many times since, taped, but nevertheless, that was very telling at that time.
Where did you go to high school?
Well, after we left, graduated from grade school, I guess it was, I went to Rogersville High School, which was about 4 or 5 miles from where the other school was. And we'd get there by, Dad was on the mail route, so we didn't have any way to get there. They had no school buses in those days, absolutely none, so we would either walk or hitchhike and usually get a ride because most everybody knew everybody in the county, and they'd pick you up and give you a ride. So I went there and did the usual, in those days, Jenkins, basketball, football, tennis, whatever it was, and anything to stay off of that damn farm, if I may say so. And then we had 4 years of that. I do remember the teachers were very strict there as well. And I was in high school, I guess, in the middle 40s, 46, 47, and a lot of guys would come back from the military in World War II after we'd won the war. They came to high school, and it was interesting. Some of the classmates were 24, and I was 17 or 16, something like that.
Were you lucky enough to get a job off the farm while you were in high school?
Oh, bless your soul. I do. I remember so well. I was delivered at home. All the kids were delivered at home. We didn't go to the hospital. Had no hospital. But the doctor who delivered me, I knew him because he occasionally come make house calls if you wanted him. But nevertheless, I wrote him a note when I was about 15, and I said, you know, doctor, I'd like to have a job. I'm so-and-so, and could you get me a job at your drugstore? Because he owned the drugstore. And consequently, he did just go there. And so I went there, and I became a soda jerk at that drugstore. And man, that was, you know, died and gone to heaven type, because what I'm accustomed to. First thing I learned after being there very shortly was the freezer they had. It was fully stocked with what was commonly known as brown mules or brown cows or something like that. It's ice cream on a stick, and I must have had way too many that first week because I'd never had one before, and it was nothing but great. Another thing it did was they had a pharmacist that worked there, and they had these little white coats, and it was fine to watch them, but they'd sometimes ask me to come back and help them count pills. They didn't have any pill counters. So I thought that was great, and that's a good job. So I decided I want to be a pharmacist until I went to college a little later, and I ran into some course called organic chemistry, so I changed my mind real rapidly. I decided I want to be a doctor.
Where did you go to college?
I went to college at Lincoln Memorial University at Harrogate, Tennessee for 2 years. Then I took off and because I got a job working for an international union called the International Printing Pressmen's Union, which was headquarters in a place that they owned in East Tennessee known as Pressman's Home, about 10 miles from Rogersville. I worked there for 2 years. Then I knew I needed to get a better education because I wasn't making much money, and I knew it was a dead-end job eventually. So I went back, and I had this time, my wife, we had not been married, but my girlfriend lived in Kingsport, so I decided I would go to East Tennessee State University in Johnson City. And I went there 2 years, lived off the campus, off of the campus, I guess it was. And on the third floor of I guess a room is granted to us with an Italian who kept hanging, not lasagna, something hung in the room, and he'd go around and cut a little slice off. We didn't have any monies at all, hardly. But what we would do during the day, we would either nibble but they had a place called where you could have dinner like for 40 cents, all you could eat. And it was what they call them rotating things, where they have them in the middle, they put all the food there and you rotate it around. So we would go there and eat, and this Italian boy would eat more than I've ever seen anybody eat in my life. But nevertheless, that's how we survived. And during that time, my wife and I, or Mary and I, got married in 1952. In Kingsport, we had our first home. It was a two-bedroom duplex, one-bedroom duplex that cost us an amazing sum of $8,000. And I was working for a law firm that was for the general counsel of that international union I told you I worked for in the home office. I was doing work like, International Union has, I better explain this, International Union has local unions throughout the United States. And the local unions, when they get in any kind of trouble for arbitration, a grievance, somebody gets fired, in those days it was at least, NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, trying to unfair labor practice charges and the like, all that they'd call the general counsel, and that's what they called directly to him, and he'd have to go out and cover. So what I would do, I got a lot of experience for that 2 years working for him and how to try those cases. And after about, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, I was trying it myself. He didn't have to go because he didn't have to be a lawyer. And that was really fun. And there's 2 types of arbitration. A lot of people don't know. It's called grievances, where under the labor contract, you have a grievance because somebody lost their job or they didn't get their vacation pay. That's called a grievance. Then you have interest arbitration. And in those days, big companies, and we represented later on Scripps Howard when I came to Knoxville, but be that as it may, the many national companies, newspapers would enter into what they call interest, I-N-T-E-R-S-T, in arbitration, which the contract would be for, say, 3 years, and then for 90 days they negotiate to try to get a new contract. And if they're unable to reach a contract, then they both agree to take it to interest arbitration and let a third-party arbitrator decide how much raise they should get, what the benefits would be. That was very popular at this time. It's not true anymore. That's pretty well gone. But
And you did that?
yeah, I'd get up statistics, finding out. I had access to what the pressmen were making in New York, Kalamazoo, Michigan, San Francisco, you name it. So we could work up charts, and I'd go over there and I'd present those to the arbitrator, and he kind of liked them because the company wasn't doing as smart as I was doing those days. Yeah. And bottom line is, I did that in NLRB cases. You didn't have to be a lawyer to be in front of that administrative law judge. So, I mean, I just love that type of stuff. But after about 2 years, I learned that I needed a law license. My partners wanted the partnerships in the firm wanted me to have a law license. And so couldn't come up with much of a way, and we didn't get around to it. But before I got to get the law license, I get a big greeting from the President of the United States. It says, welcome, we want you to defend your country. So I got drafted in the Korean War. And there I spent 2 years in the Korean War. I first at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I said I'd never be back over there because that messy, hot place. Unfortunately, I lied, and I bought a place in Hilton Head later on. Yeah. But be that as it may, I then ended up in Colorado Springs, Colorado, headed to Korea, and I got a little luck. The guy who worked for the JAG officer and the commanding general came in one day. We were sitting in a holding company of about 150 people to see where we went, Alaska or Korea. But he came in and he said, does anybody in here have a college degree and can type? Well, it turns out they had selected me to go to typing school back in what we call the first 6 months, and I went to typing school every day. And when we got out of that typing school, after 6 weeks of it, every damn day, I could type 75 words a minute without error on the old manual typewriters. And so I reluctantly held up my hand. You don't volunteer normally, but I held up my hand because I was getting sick of that place. He drove me up. He said, I'm leaving. I was a Penn State graduate. I'm leaving. I've served my 2 years, and you need the commanding general needs somebody to write his letters. It's called Congressional Correspondence, what they call it in those days. Essentially, what it would happen with a unhappy parents whose boy was out in Fort Leonard, Texas, writes a congressman and said, Congressman, they're abusing my son out there in Texas. I want you to check into that. Yes, I will, ma'am. So he'd write a letter to the commanding general, who would give it to me, my predecessor, and then me, and I'd investigate it a little and then write back a letter for the general. That's where you had to type.
How long were you in the military?
2 years.
2 years.
I'd like to know. I was counting the days. They offered me big money to re-up, and I said, there's no way in Hades I will ever be like that again.
When did you start the law school?
Well, what I did after that, we came back to Tennessee, Mary and I, and this time we had a couple of kids. I guess they were probably 1 and 3, and after a long discussion, the law firm, actually this general counsel, senior partner up there, agreed to loan me the money to go to law school. So we headed down here, and I think it was in 1960. In 1960, I went to UT, and a lot of at the time we signed up over there, I remember I was lined up, and interesting enough, I met a guy that everyone I think should know that hears this video, named from Dallas, no, where is he from? From California, no, he was from Florida. I was Dennis Jarvis. And Dennis thought I was a professor because I was older than he was. I was 30 years of age, and he was about 21, but he became good friends. And he let me go ahead of him in line. That's what I remember the best. Anyhow,
any other classmates in law school that we would know?
That's I guess the two that really stand out in my judgment, two of my dearest friends, and they are to this good day, is Wheeler Rosenbaum and Richard Ladd. Wheeler and I used to study together, and at school, and then I'd go home and I'd study there at night, and so on and so on. So you had to study a lot because they only gave one exam a year. I mean, a quarter. And by the way, I'll digress a moment to say we were on a quarter system. We went to class 6 days a week till I think it's 2 or 3 o'clock on a Saturday. And the total cost for a quarter was $75. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship. So the whole school year would cost you $225. And my total legal education, tuition-wise, cost, I think, $625. Today, I know it's a little more than that. But get back to what we were talking about, Wheeler and Richard, both smart, both were classmates, and Wheeler and I studied a lot. But anyhow, Wheeler became a circuit judge, as everybody knows, this Knoxville area, one of the finest judges, one of my best friends. And Richard Ladd became a chancellor up in Johnson City, Kingsport, and Bristol. They're two fine friends, and I'm glad to have them as classmates. I will say one thing that was worth mentioning. During orientation for the dean, our first day or so, my class was 110 students. And the dean said, look to the left of you and look to the right of you, because this time next year, one or both of you won't be there. And sure enough, when I graduated, 25 people graduated with me. So the dean, I guess he knew what he's talking about. But law school was tough in those days.
I remember my first year in law school, the first class I had was contracts, and Forrest Lacey told us the same thing. So,
Forrest Lacey, for the benefit of the audience, taught contracts, or at least tried to.
Yeah. Did you have any goals while you were in law school?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry I forgot to mention that. It kind of sounded hokey, but it did. I had 2 kids. I didn't have any money. I was borrowing money to be there, so I thought getting a job wasn't easy in those days. I mean, like, I'll tell that later, but I decided I better set some goals so that I could get a job when I get out, even though that firm, I thought I could go back to it. And one of my principal goals was try to be the first in the graduating class, because I had enough knowledge to know that helps you get a job. And try to be the editor-in-chief of your law review, which I was able to do. And finally, everybody wants to get in the order of coif, so I was fortunate enough to get, I mean, those are my goals. But anyhow,
And did you achieve all those goals?
I was successful. I finally did. I was able to do that, and that helped me get a job, I think, probably with where I am today.
What was your first job out of law school?
Well, I went back with that law firm because I owed them money. I guess they would have probably shot me if I'd gone somewhere else.
In Kingsport?
In Kingsport, yes, I forgot that. And I still did sort of the same thing I did, except I got to then have a license and I could do more. The first case we had was a 2-week trial in San Francisco. I traveled all over the country. I was you name it, from New York to Frisco to Boulder, Colorado, to the worst place I ever went was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in the wintertime. Now so I was traveling a lot. And they liked me to do that because they could be sent back to the office.
How long were you with the firm in?
I think it's 2 years. It was. We had some law work for 2 years, and I know we had some federal cases, and we had one where we got a good result, and as a result, I was able to pay them back the money I owed them in 2 years. And I was getting tired of all the damn travel because Mary had, in law school, she had sacrificed so much. She would take care of the kids. I'd just go home and I'd study at night, close the study room door, and she would take care of the kids, the bathing, all the crap, cook dinner, pay the bills, go to the grocery, take the kids here and there. So she made a lot of sacrifices for me that I'll never forget about, and I owe her big time. I know I do.
How did you and Mr. Arnett discover each other?
Well, that's interesting. I was getting tired of traveling a lot and get away from my family because I had a young family and I wanted to be home a lot. But I called Dean Warner, who was a dean at the time and an old friend of all lawyers, not just me. He was a fine gentleman. And told him I was looking around. I like Knoxville. I'd like to come back down there. If he ever had something, let me know. And he then told me all about Mr. Arnett. He said he's asked me for some people. He's interviewed 2 or 3 people, but he never hired them. So I don't know whether it's worthwhile, but you may want to consider checking with him. But it says you may want to also realize that he is one guy that goes to work early. So you need to work out something you may on what your hours are, because he will have you down there pretty early. Bottom line is, I called him. He and Jack interviewed me down here. They actually took us, Mary and I, to dinner, and it was very interesting and a nice place. And then I didn't hear anything for a month, typical, at least a month. And finally I get a call from Foster that they'd like me to come to work for them, and he offered me $2,000 less than what I was then making. I don't know whether that's typical Foster, but it was sure typical for me because I didn't think we was getting along too well on what we were making, which was about $12,000. No, I was making $12,000 a year, I believe, at the time. He offered me 10. And I thought, I had some negotiating skills being in this union business. It didn't work out too well. Talking to Foster was like shaking hands with an empty glove. So I accepted his offer. I said, well, Foster, with one condition, I'll accept your offer, which was I set my own hours. And he said, that's fine. So came down at that time and joined them thereafter.
Okay.
That was in 64, I guess. 64.
Well, tell us about your early career with Mr. Arnett, and was Mr. Draper here at the time?
Oh, yes, Mr. Draper. Jack, a dear friend and a fine lawyer, was here, and I worked with both of them. Continued to do some of the things I had been doing. And actually, when I came to Knoxville, there was very few people who did labor and employment law when I came to Knoxville. Ed and John Racing is the only 2 that comes to my mind. So as a result, I was able to obtain a lot of clients who needed it because they had unions going around those days. So as a result of that, though, I also was able to, because of the specialty, I decided I'd charge a little more than Foster and Jack, who were primarily what I call them tort lawyers, just like. So, as I recall, Jack was charging $10 an hour, and Arnett $15 an hour. So I charged 20 or 25, I can't remember which, and that people hired me. So after it wasn't about a year and a half, because I had some kind of percentage arrangement, I think, with him. But anyhow, a year and a half, they made me a partner. Because we did improve the economic feasibility of the firm. But yes, I learned a lot from Jack and Foster. They taught me so much about how to practice law, how to deal with other lawyers, how to do what the fundamental things a lawyer should be. And Foster and Jack both talked, and I think it's still in our website today, something called the 3 I's. Intelligence of what a lawyer should possess. He should impress intelligence, he should have industry, and most important of all, he should have integrity, practice integrity with a realization there's no degrees of integrity. You're either pregnant or you ain't pregnant.
Were things different back then in terms of a young lawyer getting started in the practice?
Oh yes, it was significantly different, Bill. We were still, when I started, had the old common law pleadings, a declaration, a plea and abatement to respond, a not guilty to respond, demurrer frontage, and things like that. We never heard of it. We had no rules of procedure. We had no discovery rules. So when you had a lawsuit, you went out and interviewed your own witnesses. If you had any, you go out and take your own pictures. And I've been close to getting run over on Magnolia many times from taking intersection pictures. The other lawyer would stipulate the pictures that you made them, but he'd stipulate them, and they'd introduce, you'd try your case. If you had a jury verdict as much as $8,000, that's unusual. 10 was unheard of. And you get your witnesses, try the case. Matter of fact, if a jury didn't show up, one or two, the judge would go down and say, Sheriff, go out there and get a couple of those hanger-ons and put them on the jury, sitting out there and hang around the courthouse in those days. And then you go back, you'd be over at 4 o'clock, 4:30, and you go back up the street to Bass Rail and tell the lawyer to have a beer or something, and you go about your business and go home. None of this other crap, but that's drastically changed. There's no doubt about that.
What did your type of cases that you were handling change much after you became a partner?
Yes, I guess they did. I was able to obtain, the firm represented Blue Diamond Coal Company before I came with them, but I started doing a lot of work for them because they have 3 or 4 coal mines, big, and have a lot of miners up in Kentucky. But I did, and Phillips Electronics was also another client that I procured. They were formerly Magnavox, and they were here for 25 years. UPS, I could name a furniture company in Maryville, Lazy Boy. We did work. I mean, they needed somebody, and it wasn't too long that I just had really more business I could handle.
What kind of cases did you enjoy the most?
Oh, a lot of those labor cases, and because it's always you got all sorts of emotion in those, and you got a lot of strategy, and the law sometimes don't make any difference because you have with miners particularly, and the Teamsters Union in those days, they were kind of prone to strike. If they didn't like what happened, they just called the people on strike, and they call walkout strikes if you have a no strike clause in your collective bargaining contract. Matter of fact, we had one with, when I later came, I represented Knoxville Youth Sentinel for a good while in their labor stuff. Now, I don't think they have any more unions now. We were, and in Oak Ridge, I represented Oak Ridge newspaper too. I'd forgotten about that. But the cases, I think the 2 or 3 that I remember, one for Phillips Electronics, they got sued in a class action under ERISA by 12 retirees claiming we'd violated the federal law on retirement benefits. And they filed a class action in Greenville. Judge Hull, the federal judge at that time, certified the class, and then he decided on a motion for summary judgment that we did violate it. He gave a verdict of $1 million, gave the attorney, awarded his attorney's fees, and the client was, shall we say, less than happy, as was I. We just think it was wrong. So we appealed that case to 6th Circuit. To a lot of credit, and Dan worked with me on that case. Dan Ray is a partner here. He's what I call an ERISA expert, a very bright guy. But anyhow, to make a long story short, the 6th Circuit fortunately reversed Judge Hull, not only his whole thing, but they dismissed the total action. I do not remember why, but man, I was turned from an ogre to hero in about a year. The other was Blue Diamond Coal Company. Well, I had two big cases from them that I know. I mean, we had a lot of them, but the 2 biggest ones was when they bought a mine up in Kentucky when they had 3 mines already with about 600 people working. And the union called a walkout strike, or common called a strike, not a walkout strike, an economic strike trying to get a big contract. So for 1 year they were on strike. For 1 year I negotiated and up there, met and negotiated, quote, in good faith under the law for the terms of a new contract. The proposal of the United Mine Workers in those days was 114 pages, and our proposed contract was 8 pages. That gives you any truth about how tough the negotiations were. We'd meet in Williamsburg, Kentucky at the Holiday Inn, and after every meeting, I left a couple of minutes early because I always got chased down to I-75, and that's when speed limit was 75, but I wasn't honoring it at that time. I get back, but pretty bad country. Most people up there go armed all the time. But anyhow, the strike got violent. 2 or 3 people were killed, shots into the mine. We could go in, as their lawyer, I could go in to the mine, have to cross a picket line where they could search your car. I mean, this is all kind of sounds fantasy now, but those days, and they had a picket shack up on the hill with a guy with a rifle and a bead on you. If you did something you shouldn't do, you'd be in trouble. So we finally got to strike. Some of the guys, after about a year, wanted to go back to work. They were starving up there, so this back to work movement on a certain day, and the company got Kentucky State Police involved, who were very cooperative at the time. They had about 4 or 5 cruisers or 6 cruisers came to the picket line to escort them across. When they started to escort them across, all hell broke out. And not only with that, everybody was raising Cain there. The interesting thing of that is that the wives of the pickets who didn't want to go back to work stood out by the side of those 5 or 6 cruisers, or whatever it was, with a 2x4 and a railroad spike down through it, and they took out every tire of every vehicle there. So we made the New York News on that. I think it was the Brinkley, I believe it was. That was bad, but it did break the strike. The strike got settled.
Tell us about your involvement in the bar and legal organizations.
Well, I've been active in the bar because I love it. You see other lawyers and meet new lawyers, and I encourage everybody to do it. But I was obviously a member of all the bars that you can. And I don't know if that's what you're asking about or about my connection with Board of Law Examiners and things like that. I don't know which one.
Just legal organizations that
yeah, well,
had to
okay.
do with the bar.
Well, the Tennessee Bar Foundation was Knoxville in Tennessee. I founded and formed and served as chairman of the first labor and employment law section for the state of Tennessee, for the KBA section, as well as the Knoxville section. And I served as president of that for years, still a member. Oh, good Lord. That's kind of hard to think about.
You were a member of the Tennessee Board of Bar.
Oh yeah, the law examiners.
Law examiners, weren't
Yeah, I'd forgotten about, not forgotten, I'd slipped my mind on that. Bill, I actually got appointed by the Supreme Court to the Tennessee Board of Bar Examiners, where I served for, I think, 12 years, like in the 90s to the 2000s. First as secretary, then as president. That was a lot of fun, a lot of pleasure. We had monthly meetings down in Nashville. We'd meet with the court, and we'd meet with the deans of the law school. Well, the examiners do, the board supervises the law schools. They kind of theoretically report to the board, and we in turn report to the Supreme Court. So we met with the Supreme Court regularly and in private sessions, let them know what's going on.
What about community affairs?
Oh, yes. I am a great believer in that because I was active in many community affairs. I guess I was a joiner when I first came to Knoxville, and I'm a great believer, and I try to pass this on to younger lawyers. Know what's going on in your community. Be a part of your community. Know who the movers and shakers of your community are. Get yourself exposed because you make your living here and learn all this. So one time I was in, I think, Sertoma, Kiwanis, another club or two, Boy Scouts of America. I was on the council, teen board for years and years, March of Dimes. I was on the Knoxville Symphony Board for 25 years. And I'm trying to think of something else that's the basic board. Because you make your bucks here. So.
Have you written any books or articles?
Before I get to that, I just happen to think two things. One is how to get yourself known as a lawyer. I read this somewhere and I thought it was worth remembering, and it just dawned on me what it was. This guy he said, get yourself known as a young lawyer by running for a political office. He said, whatever you do, be sure and lose. You got your name out there. And that also reminds me of Arnett. Used to introduce me all over town to new lawyers. We had about 300 in those days, and I think there's over 3,000 now, but whatever it is, he would always introduce me, Mr. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. Why don't you meet Louis Hagood, so-and-so? He's the most promising lawyer in Knoxville. He said, pause a second. He said, he'll promise you any damn thing. Okay. Oh, what articles? Yeah, I wrote a lot I've got a lot of articles in the Tennessee Bar Journal. I guess one of them, the proudest of is because in the labor field, I used to go annually to convention of the labor section of the ABA. And we'd met, and labor lawyers always spend a little money. So we used to meet at Acapulco, San Francisco, Palm Springs, you name it, the fancy places, that's where we went. But I was asked early on to help be a contributing author to a book that the labor group I was connected with came out with every year and updated every year, written by lawyers who specialize in the labor and employment law. And that's where you got your research. We didn't have Westlaw, Lexis, and that stuff. But that book was invaluable, and I served on it for years and years. I'd write a chapter every year.
Did you ever do any articles about the Tennessee Board of Law exam?
Oh, yes. I wrote a lot of articles about labor and employment law. I used to give a lot of seminars, but I did, when I was getting my presidential year as member of the board. And by the way, I served with two fine gentlemen. One of them was Prince Chambliss, a lawyer out of Memphis, was on the board with me, and the other was Lee Barfield, who was with Bestbury and Sims, and Prince Chambliss was with Armstrong Allen in those days. Two great firms, two great lawyers, two great gentlemen. But we were pretty firm with we didn't let anybody, because when we said, we bless you as a lawyer, the public's entitled to rely on us as you're qualified. And we were very hard. We were just firm. We did not, I'd like to think we were firm but fair. I know one thing, when I started, the three of us, I was East Tennessee, and we had Middle and West Tennessee, we wrote the damn bar examination. We proctored the bar examination. And then we graded the bar examination. And it'd take 2 or 3 weeks to grade those papers to give them fairness. Then we would have to go down and have the character fitness hearing. But we all did our job. They didn't pay us very much, but we didn't care. But to get back to your question, when I was, my last year, Chief Justice DeWater called me about 2 weeks before we were going to have a dinner in Nashville and asked me to write. He said, Louis, there's not much history at all on the bar examiner. I said, I want you to research it and write an article on it and present it to the courts. So I did. And there wasn't much on it. Good Lord, I had to go to the UT to get the original statutes. But I found out one of the things, and I wrote an article, I think it's published somewhere in Tennessee Bar Journal or somewhere, maybe Tennessee Law Review, I do not know, but it's published. What's it called? I mean, something about being a bar, admission to bars. But the bottom line is I found that like in 1900, you could work in a lawyer's office for 1 year. He could take you down to the courthouse to the trustee, county court's office somewhere, make an affidavit that you're a man of good character, and then you get your license and start practicing with him.
Based upon your experience, all the years of practice that you've had, what do you think are some of the most important things for a lawyer to do and think about in preparing a case for trial?
Well, without hesitation, Foster taught us all about preparation. And he said repeatedly, as I'm sure you recall, Mr. Sims, the good Lord can forgive your ignorance. Nobody can forgive your lack of preparation. I've heard that a lot of times. He was right. We did get prepared. We would sometimes maybe over-prepared. I don't think you can do that, but nevertheless, we probably won more lawsuits based on out-preparing the other lawyer than on anything else in our situation. But I've got to make a reference to when I was in Kingsport before I actually got my law license, I think. It could have been afterwards. I used to get my hair cut at a three-hole barbershop. When I mean a three-hole, little hole-in-the-wall barbershop had 3 chairs and a plain wall on the opposite from the chairs. You couldn't see a counter, didn't see a counter, but you saw a little sign that they had framed in the barbershop. It said the following, quote, "Preparation is like making love to a widow. You just simply cannot overdo it." And I've thought of that so many times in preparation for a lawsuit. It's just hard to overdo.
What's one of the toughest cases you ever tried?
Well, I don't know. I had a lot of them was pretty tough, I guess, but I think the one that kind of wore me out was when I came from Knoxville from Kingsport. I was contacted and hired ultimately by 8 poor Teamsters drivers who had lost their job at Mason-Dixon because somebody had stupidly called a wildcat strike, and that is gross. Anyhow, the bottom line, they didn't have any money. Being stupid, and young, so I tried to take it on a pro rata, on a contingency basis, which was, I'll repeat, stupid. We tried that case in Kingsport probably a year later. I sued the union for breach of the duty of fair representation under the federal labor law, which you can, and I sued Mason-Dixon for firing them for some reason. Anyhow, we tried the case for a week. It was going pretty good, I think, I thought, and I was trying to make some hay with the defendant's best witness on cross-examination, and guess what? Every time I would make an objection, it was on a Friday, I'd object. I would ask the question, the lawyer would object, and the judge at that time was Dayton E. Phillips. Well, just let it in for whatever it's worth. So that went on. I wouldn't make any hay at all. And I finally did something that wasn't very professional. I'm not proud of it, but I'd probably do it again. I looked at the lawyer, I looked at the witness, I looked at the judge, I looked at the jury, and I said, you know, folks, my pappy always told me I could never win a squirting contest with a skunk, so I sat down. And I got a smile out of the judge and the jury, but nevertheless, they went out, the jury went out about 5:30. They came back in about an hour. Sheriff had 2 questions. Oh, Lord. And by the way, Jack Draper helped me try that case because he's a much better trial lawyer than I was then and now. But we both had a rather strange feeling when asked for them. The first question was, the jury wants to know if they have a pot of coffee. Yes, give me a pot of coffee. So what's the other question? They want to know if they can have a calculator. So I had a big smile, and Jack had a sigh of release, and they came back with a verdict later that night of over $1 million for the men and almost $200,000 attorney's fees for us. And you know, that's really a bundle of money, but nevertheless, the epilogue of that is the story. The defendants filed a motion for a new trial. I get a call at home here in Knoxville from Judge Dayton E. Phillips. He's no longer with us, so I feel I can mention this. Quote, "Louis, I hate to do it, but I think this motion ought to be granted, and I'm thinking I'm going to grant it. And yes, I don't have to grant it." So I said to him something also not very professional, but I said, "Judge, you got to do what you got to do, but I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to appeal this and reverse your posterior." And I hung up the phone on him. That wasn't very professional, but so I did. I won it on appeal, sent it back retried it again. Actually, Richard Ladd tried the second time. It was 5 years later. The jury gave the same verdict. We felt good, except the lawyer came up for the defendants. The union said that he found a case just came out in a federal court in Kansas, I think it was, and sent it to me. that a quote, person under the bankruptcy law would include a local labor union, so he was going to bankrupt the verdict if we didn't settle it. I think we settled it for about $200,000. The guy's been in it 8 years. Jack and I made about 10 cents an hour for all those years. That's the hardest case I ever tried.
Boy. In your opinion, has the practice of law changed in any significant respects since you first started practicing?
Oh, Bill, it has changed tremendously in my view. As I said before, we had the common law pleadings, we didn't have any rules of discovery, we didn't have anything, and we didn't know what comparative fault was ever heard about, or medical malpractice act, or all the things we have, and including most of all, I think, mediation. Mediation came on board, but the practice has changed drastically because there's so many laws being passed, and limiting all the employment discrimination law has come since I've been practicing. You could terminate a person for any reason. When I first started practicing, even if it's based on his origin or his national origin or his color, the only remedy he had was federal court, Judge Taylor. I got to tell you a little about Judge Taylor. I'll digress to do that. Because it's a constitutional question, he dismissed all of them. So they had no remedy until all the laws about sex, discrimination, and now, as you know, transgender and everything else that we had. So drastically, it's changed a lot. And I will mention Judge Taylor. He was a very strong judge, very forceful, had the most current docket in the country, and there ain't any lawyer that's been practicing 50 years don't have some blood spill on his floor. He was a mean one. The judge I really want to mention about, though, is when I got lucky in a case I tried up in Sevier County years ago. I forgot about that case. His name is Judge Shepard. He was a criminal judge and a circuit judge. I tried a jury trial for a defendant car wreck in my early days, and sure enough, I was lucky enough to win it, which you don't do against Sevier County residents ordinarily. Filed a motion for new trial. Judge Shepard heard all the motions in the back room of his department store in Sevier County named Rubles with no court reporters. I walked in on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, and I walked in. The other defense lawyer was already there talking to the judge. I walked in, he said, "Hey, Lewis, good morning." He said, "Now I got to know what you offered to pay Bill before this jury went crazy and dismissed his case." I said, "Judge, I think that's inappropriate, and I'm very reluctant to even tell that." "Well, I don't care whether you tell it or not." He said, "I'm going to give him a new trial if you don't pay him that money. Pay him what you offered him." So I called my client, and we paid him what they'd offered and shut it up. So that's home cooking at its best. I'm sorry about digressing, but those two I wanted to mention. And it's changed the mediation process and the camaraderie and the fellowship. We used to have coffee tables to go for lawyers that go at 10 and 3 o'clock in the daytime. But anyhow.
What do you think are the most important things today that a lawyer should be aware of in their daily practice?
And what?
In their daily practice.
Well, lawyers represent clients. The client trusts them. They should trust them. If they don't, they should learn not to client. They should do their best time, effort, skill to represent that client and undertake to help him or her solve the problem they have. And you can do anything ethically to get that done. So it takes a lot of work, hard work, and dedication to do that. The other thing that you've got to be guided by is when I think of the 3 I's of this firm, you've got to do it honestly. And other than that, Bill, I don't know hardly how to answer that question. It's pretty broad in itself.
It is. Well, I've got 2 more questions.
Okay.
I want to ask you. First of all, is there anything that I haven't already asked you that you wish I had?
Well, if you got 30 seconds, I wish you'd have asked me about a couple of characters we had in our bar. Ray Jenkins was one of them, and Ray was a guy that everyone knows, Ray H. Jenkins. But he used to be the kind of a guy who was fun and frivolity, but a good trial lawyer. And he would tell you something. Now, Lewis, I'm about to tell you what I'm about to tell you is confidential. But if you tell it, you be sure and tell it's confidential. And the other thing he'd ask me was, Ray, how do you charge for this criminal work you do? Well, Lewis, that's easy. I had a call from Kentucky today, and the guy said, what do you charge me, mister? I'm charged with murder. What do you charge me, lawyer, to defend me? He said, well, that's easy, young man. I'll charge $10,000 if you got the witnesses. It's going to be $15,000 if I got to bring the witnesses. I've never forgotten that. But no, you haven't asked me anything else. I thought of those two, I got to tell.
Well, my final question is, what accomplishments during your practice are you the most proud of?
Well, that's obviously a difficult answer, but I guess I feel the best about, I enjoyed the bar examiners very much. I thought we was doing something. I was on the original committee for the started mediation for the federal court here. I thought that was important. But frankly, what I think is the best accomplishment is my efforts and final results in obtaining a law clerk for the local chancery judges here who didn't have one and had to do their own research and the like. And I talked to every bar president. It took me 5 years, but I finally did a survey on Knoxville, and consequently, it's Knoxville, Tennessee, Nashville, Chattanooga, and was able finally to get them a paid assistant. And I think that's one of the finest things I've done to serve justice, is get the judges some help and let the law be applied.
That's great. Mr. Hagood, we thank you for your time and for you making yourself available for this interview today. And I just want to say personally, it's been an honor and a privilege to practice with you and Mr. Arnett and Mr. Draper for 44 years.
I know I feel a little reciprocate that, Bill. You've been a treasure for us, and I did tell the cameraman when he came in today that he kind of had to be careful about lawyers because they'll never use